On November 15th, Russia decided to test an anti-satellite weapon. This was really troublesome and really a horrific idea, not just because it reminds us that space can be a military domain, but because it had an instant reaction. It created a bunch of debris. And debris is really bad in space because even small, tiny pieces of debris actually move in space at the speed of 10 to 14 kilometers per second. When even a small piece of material is traveling that fast, it can do an intense amount of damage to spacecraft. In fact, the International Space Station astronauts had to evacuate station and go into their safety pods because they were afraid that the space station would get hit with some of the debris that was created by that Russian anti-satellite test. So this concept of debris is really, really dangerous, not only for humans in space, but for all of the other wonderful things we have in space, all the things we use to harness space resources to help our lives here on Earth, our remote sensing satellites, our Earth observation satellites, and our telecommunications satellites. So you'd think there ought to be a law, right? My name is Michelle Hanlon. I'm a space lawyer. I teach aviation and space law at the University of Mississippi. I'm also the co-founder of For All Moonkind, which is the only organization in the world that is focused on protecting our human heritage, protecting our history in space. And I'm also the president of the National Space Society, an international organization that is promoting citizen science, citizen space. Our entire goal at the National Space Society is to move the humans who want to go, not all humans, just the ones who want to go, into space, so we continue the exploration of the wonderful universe that we live in through space and into the future. I'm here to talk to you today about space law. So what is space law? Well, we know that international law is what is really just sort of the general consent of states. States create rules that generally apply to everybody. More particularly, we have something called the Statute of the International Court of Justice, which provides a hierarchy of law. And so when we think about law, we think about international law, we think about treaties and conventions, we think about something called custom. And that's just, sort of things that just happen consistently and constantly, they just become law. We just recognize them as being the way to do things. General principles of law recognized by civilized nations. And when we don't have anything else to lean on, we'll look at judicial decisions and teachings of the most highly qualified publicists. What does that mean? That means you could become an expert on space law and contribute to this concept of international law and of space law. So with respect to what is the purpose of law? The purpose of law is to manage relationships, originally to manage relationships between humans, and that has grown into managing the relationships between states, between countries. And we recognize that countries have a general responsibility to one another, aside from any law whatsoever. We have committed as a world, as a globe, to treat each other with certain general principles. That said, we do have a space law. So why do we have space law? Well, as it happens, space law came about in the 1950s. So here on Earth, we know we had a lot of conflict, and we decided early on that we're going to accept everybody's borders, and we're going to treat those borders as sacrosanct. And then when we relate to each other, we're going to relate to each other as nation states. And we decided on top of that our borders aren't just going to cover land, they're going to cover all of airspace as well. And so when we think about flying over a country, you can't do that without the permission of another country. And then in 1957, something extraordinary happened. The Soviet Union was able to launch a satellite into orbit. This was Sputnik. This changed everything. In particular, two things happened. First, we understood as a human community, as an international community, that space was now an open domain. We now, as humans, can access space. And we knew, coming out of World War II, and in the throes of the Cold War, we knew we wanted to keep the peace in space. And so we hightailed it to the negotiating table to make sure that we keep that space peaceful. The second thing that happened was when Sputnik went around the globe, nobody objected to it. Nobody said, hey, Soviet Union, you are encroaching on our space. You can't do that. You know, if this had been in airspace overflying a country, then anybody could have shot it down with impunity because it was violating their sovereignty. But this was above that airspace and nobody objected. And so all of a sudden we had what we call instant customary international law. The international community instantly agreed that anything that happens in space, we're not going to take our sovereign boundaries to space. So space was free for access, exploration, and use by all. So I said we hightailed it to the negotiating table. In 1957, we started talking about having a treaty to keep the peace in space. It took us about 10 years, but we did. In 1967, many nations came together to sign the Outer Space Treaty. And then after that, we had a bunch of treaties. We had the Rescue and Return Agreement, the Liability Convention, the Registration Convention, and then the Moon Agreement. These are all binding law. Now, the treaties, a country has to sign it, right? So we know we have 104 countries out of 190 some that have signed the Outer Space Treaty. But unity about space law sort of started to die down a little bit. So the Moon Agreement is only signed by 18 nations. And of those 18 nations, only Australia is one that is considered truly spacefaring at this point. So important to know, the Moon Agreement, it exists, it binds 18 nations, but it does not bind China, the United States, and Russia have not signed that Moon Agreement. So we're not going to talk about it. We're going to know that it's out there and that there are countries bound by it, but only 18 out of the 190. So as I said, you know, this sort of ability to negotiate and agree to binding treaties sort of ended after the Registration Convention, but that wasn't the end of law with respect to space law. We have something called soft law. So we created binding, non-binding principles and guidelines. And what's really cool about these guidelines, though, is that they are created by consensus at the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And so even though these are just sort of a sense of the committee, because everybody on that committee has to agree to them, it would be really hard for a country to say, oh, hey, you know, we spent 15 years talking about these guidelines, and now we're just not going to follow them. So this is what we call soft law. It feels binding to the countries that were involved in the negotiation of them. So we're going to talk today about the Outer Space Treaty, the treaty on principles governing the activities of states in the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies. So what do we know about this treaty just from its name? Okay, first, it's just principles. These are not rules of the road. These are not, you must not, you may not, you cannot. These are just saying, hey, we're going to agree to these fuzzy concepts because we think it's important, and we're going to try and sort of meet these standards. And it's the activities of states. Doesn't say the activities of humans, right? It's the activities of states in outer space. And so right away we see sort of a gap, because in 1967, nobody was operating in space as a private company. They were all operating as nations. And that's different now, right? We have a lot of individuals, a lot of private companies looking to space. But nonetheless, the treaty on this treaty on principles governing activities of states is like the magna carta of space. This is the framework by which all of space activity is governed, under which all of space activity is governed. Article 1 is the meat, is really the whole reason we went to the table. We decided that the outer space is the exploration and use of outer space is the province of all humankind. And we decided that space shall be free for exploration and use by all, and that everyone will have free access. This is really important. Space is for everyone. Never forget that. Never think it's just for billionaires. Never think it's just for governments. Space is for you and space is for me. We all have the right to access space and do in space anything we want, except for what you're not allowed to do under the auspices of this treaty. So we want to have freedom of scientific investigation, and we want to encourage international cooperation. So what's really important when you think about space, though, is where does space start? Funny enough, we don't know. The international community has not decided where space starts. and where airspace ends. And why is this important? Because remember, I told you countries own the airspace above them, so you can take that border and take it right up to through all of that airspace. But countries cannot own anything beyond that. So space is free for all. And because we don't have a concept of where that might be, we have two nations in the world, Australia and Denmark, who have said, okay, we're going to call it at 100 kilometers, but we don't have international agreement. And as our technology grows, and as we have more and more aircraft and spacecraft working and doing things in that fuzzy period between air and space, this is another gap that we have to address in space law. But I want to just sort of really point out, so this is a picture taken by a satellite of military exercises in Russia. Okay, if this had been taken by an airplane, completely illegal, Russia would have had the opportunity, the right, the legal sovereign right to shoot down an airplane that took this picture. However, this picture was taken by a satellite in space. So we are able to use space. We are able to harness the resources of space to look into other countries. That is what we mean by the freedom of exploration and use, even though we have these concepts of privacy, these concepts of national sovereignty here on Earth. From space, those disappear. And that's really important because hopefully a lot of these things that block our international relations and our international comity and kinship will also go away as we continue to harness the resources of space. Article 2 is also incredibly important. Space is not subject to national appropriation. You cannot claim territory in space. When the Americans went to space and they put up the American flag, they didn't say we claim the moon for our nation. No, they said we came in peace for all humankind. You cannot claim territory in space anywhere. And this is actually becoming, again, a source of a gap, because we know we want to be able to mine space resources, not so much to make big bucks, but because in order to explore space, we need to harness the resources in space. It costs a lot of money to get stuff into space. And so as we explore space, we're going to need to use resources in space to support ourselves and sustain ourselves. And so under Article 2, we can't claim territory, but we have to be able to use those resources. And so the United States had announced to the world, President Obama announced to the world in 2015, that the United States interprets Article 2 to say we cannot claim territory, but we can use the resources. UAE and Luxembourg have also adopted similar laws, and we're seeing that same kind of legislation sort of starting in places like Japan and other countries. Article 3 says, hey, space is not a wild frontier where nothing goes on. International law applies to space. You can't just go up and do whatever you want. The very basic precepts of international law that we are bound by on Earth follow us to space. Law is not bound by the boundaries of air and space. No, whatever laws we have here on Earth, they are going to apply in space. Article 4 is the meat, what the negotiators really worked on. When we talked about why we have the Outer Space Treaty, we're talking about keeping the peace in space. The international community went to the table in 1957 because they didn't want the Cold War to bleed into space. And so Article 4 says you cannot place in orbit around Earth any objects carrying nuclear weapons or any other weapons of mass destruction. And you can't put those on any other celestial bodies anywhere. So, we have freedom and exploration of use of space under Article 1. This is one of only two restrictions we have with respect to the freedom of activity. You cannot place nuclear weapons or WMD in orbit or in other celestial bodies or anywhere in outer space. And the moon and other celestial bodies shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. Although peaceful purposes doesn't necessarily mean you can't use military personnel, you will make sure those military personnel use these exclusively for peaceful purposes. Okay, so that's great. Look at the gaps, okay? The lawyers see gaps all the time. Here, we can't place nuclear weapons or any other kinds of WMD, but we can place conventional weapons in space. So far, nobody has that we know of, but that is a possibility. That's a gap we have to fill. And the moon and other celestial bodies are to be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. Well, what does that mean? That doesn't say space must be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. So that's another gap, we want to close that gap. And when we think about that Russian ASAT test, it doesn't feel like testing an anti-satellite weapon is a peaceful purpose. But when we think about peaceful purpose, it's really been interpreted to mean non-military purpose. And so when we have that ASAT test, and China has done an ASAT test, and India and the United States as well, so I'm not trying to pile on Russia, but the concept is that we're not causing a war, we're not using it, we're just testing. And so it's still considered a peaceful purpose. But there are gaps in this, and we need to fill those gaps. Article 5 is a wonderful article. It's a return and rescue. Astronauts are considered envoys of all humankind. If an astronaut is in danger, everybody is going to help that astronaut. This is the one provision where we finally recognize on paper that we are all the same. We are all in this together. We are all humans. And so any humans in space deserve our protection and our support. Article 6 is the way we go from Article 6 is the way we go from talking about states and nations and countries to making the Outer Space Treaty apply to non-states, to apply to private companies like SpaceX or Blue Origin, to apply to people who are doing things in space, but not as part of the government. It's a very important provision because the nations are responsible for any activities of their nationals in space, any activities by even non-governmental. So think about it this way. I used to live very close to Canada. I'm in the United States right now. If I'm a US citizen, if I go to Canada and I burn down a gas station, that's bad, that's a crime. I will come back to the US and say, oh, it happened in Canada, I'm fine. The US may deport me to Canada so that I face justice. However, the United States doesn't owe Canada anything because of what I did, right? That's all my responsibility. That's different in space. In space, if I were to do that same thing, if there are two human communities on the moon and I walked from the US community to the Canadian community and burned down their habitat, then the United States is liable. Every nation bears international responsibility for all of their nationals in space. And that's really important. And it's why places like the United States have a very robust licensing process, but it doesn't always work. So this picture here is a tiny little satellite. I know it's tiny, right? Called a Swarm. And Swarm wanted to test their satellites. And so they went to the United States and said, hey, we'd like to test these satellites. And the United States said, no, these are too small for us to capture. And we're worried that if we can't track it, it's going to cause damage. And then we will be liable for that damage. And Swarm said, okay, thanks, US. And what did Swarm do? They didn't try to make a bigger satellite. They didn't try to figure out a better way to track it. They went to India and said, hey, India, we want to just launch these satellites. Will you do that? And India said yes. Okay, so we see this gap in the law. We need to start working better as an international community to make sure people can't shop where they're going to launch from. Article 7 talks about liability. So you are, like I said, you are internationally liable for any damage you cause in space. This is international law, and like I said, it's taken international law one step further by making you internationally liable for any national of yours who does damage in space. So on top of that, this was such an important concept that not only was it captured in the Outer Space Treaty, but we actually negotiated another convention called the Liability Convention to go into more details. So if a state launches something and it causes damage on Earth, they're absolutely liable. They just pay. Who cares? Who cares who's at fault? Nobody cares. You're going to pay. If it happens in space, though, then we're going to look for fault. We're going to look to see whose fault was it that the damage occurred. And so we've actually had a collision in space. In 2009, a defunct Russian satellite crashed into a US commercial satellite owned by a company called Iridium. And this obviously completely damaged and destroyed Iridium. It also created a debris field. So that should have invoked the Liability Convention, right? Well, it didn't because they settled out of court. They settled out of diplomatic channels. And so we've never actually had any country actually use the Liability Convention. So it's going to be very interesting to see as space gets more crowded, how that plays out. Article 8 talks about registering your objects. If you have an object that you've launched into space, you retain jurisdiction and control over that object. You can never give that away. The Outer Space Treaty doesn't let you absolve yourself of liability if you sell your satellite. And so this makes, again, a very interesting concept under international law, because this doesn't say, when you sell, then you're no longer in control. So if you launch a satellite, and then when the satellite is on orbit, you sell it to somebody else, you are still liable and you are still responsible for that object. Another gap that we have to deal with, because we want to encourage such commerce in outer space. So and again, registration is so important that we have another convention on registration. And as you can imagine, as I was showing you the concept of this debris field, it's very important to know what's on orbit. And the United Nations keeps a registry, and this is what the registry looks like. When you launch something, you're supposed to tell the United Nations. The problem with the registry, and here's the gap, the problem with the registry is that you only register once. And we know that technologically, these objects are moving and their orbits are changing because of Earth's orbit, right? Because of Earth's gravity. And so we need to find a way to keep updating this registry so that we always know where we are. That's called space situational awareness. But Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, so we talked about what are the limits of your freedom of exploration and use. We saw Article 4, you can't put nuclear weapons or WMD in space. Article 9 is the only other restriction. You are going to implement your activities in space with due regard to the corresponding interests of all other states. You're going to avoid harmful contamination of other celestial bodies, and you're going to avoid adverse changes to the environment of Earth. So what does that mean? Due regard, that sounds really good, doesn't it? In the ordinary, for you and me, due regard might be, just having respect for one another. Well, lawyers like to complicate things. And so we have this concept of due regard, which is a balancing test. We're going to look at what the activity, we're going to see what could have been done differently. We're going to balance the two activities. So it's a balancing act. That is not for lawyers, for investors. Balancing is not a good thing, right? Because if I call the due regard provision, they here pay your lawyer provision, because lawyers can argue anything endlessly. And so if you have just this concept of due regard, if something happens in space, you're going to argue whose fault is it? And if you have a balancing test, you can argue that forever. So this is one of those gaps. We really need to figure out what due regard means. And that is right now the focus of this generation of space policy and law, understanding what due regard means. Harmful contamination is covered by the Committee of Space Research's Planetary Protection Policy. And that this COSPAR actually promulgates very specific rules about what you can send to other planets. Why? Because we really want to know. We want to know how we started. We want to know how life started. And we don't want to contaminate the biology of other planets because we don't want to contaminate our understanding of ourselves. And so, a few years ago, a private company put a payload on an Israeli launch, Bereshit, and didn't tell anybody in the world that they put tardigrades on that payload. Now, these tardigrades were sent to the moon, and sadly, the Bereshit had a hard landing. It crash landed on the moon. But imagine if these tardigrades had ended up on Mars. Imagine if this person hadn't told anybody that they had sent tardigrades to Mars. Imagine 30 years from now, humans get to Mars, and they take a soil sample, and the tardigrades are there. Think about how that clouds evolution and our understanding of evolution. An entire direction of science would be sort of derailed because somebody snuck tardigrades to Mars. So this is a really important provision, that harmful contamination. As the co-founder of For All Mankind, I would like to see that concept of protection sort of grow. We need to be responsible when we explore space, and we need to work together as an international community to make sure we don't send tardigrades to Mars inadvertently. So we just talked a lot about gaps in the law, but all is not lost. You know what? We are actually working on this. The Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space is a United Nations agency. It has about 104 members now, and they meet 3 times a year to talk about things like debris mitigation. They have recently, established a working group on space, on the sustainable development and exploration of space. And they came up with 21 guidelines to guide how we are going to make sure we use and harness and explore space sustainably. That was agreed by all the nations by consensus. It's not binding law, but all of the nations agreed that these were important. And right now we have a new working group on space resource utilization. So there are people looking at and addressing all of these gaps and trying to find ways, just like we did back in 1957, we came to the table understanding we needed to do something. And at the time we did it to keep the peace. Now we're realizing we need to figure out how to make sure we continue that peace, even as we continue our activities. There's also bleed over. So the United Nations First Committee, which is looks at reducing the arms race, preventing an arms race on Earth, actually in October passed a resolution that said, hey, this is really important. We're going to look at space as well. And so now we have this bleed over that signifies just how important space is to our society and how important it is to keep that peace in space. So on top of the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space looking to advance our laws in space, the First Committee is also going to join that effort to keep this peace in space and reduce space threats. We also have multilateral efforts outside of the United Nations. The Artemis Accords were promulgated by 8 nations negotiating together. The Artemis Accords were sort of conceived by the United States. Most of them, all they do is mirror the Outer Space Treaty. I won't go through these one by one, but you will see that most of the provisions of the Artemis Accords actually support, reconfirm, or go farther than the Outer Space Treaty in terms of commitment. They do attempt to fill the gaps. Section 5 of the Artemis Accords talks about interoperability. This is common sense. If we are all sending humans and robots to the moon or to other planets or to asteroids, and we are out there together, remember Article 5 of the Outer Space Treaty, which says, we're going to help each other in space. If we want to be able to help each other, we don't want to spend our time trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Let's make sure all of our systems work together. Section 10 is the space resources provision, and that talks about how we're going to extract resources. It again reiterates the position that you cannot claim territory in space, but you can use resources that you get from space. And then Section 11 talks about the deconfliction of activities, talks about teasing out this notion of due regard. It talks about creating a safety zone. And this is really important, though. It's an area of notification and coordination. And there's a reason it's called a safety zone, not a keep out zone. So the concept isn't to keep everybody away. It's just to let people know that this is what we're doing in this space. And please help, have due regard for our activities. I did Section 9 of the Artemis Accords. Sorry, I usually have a slide on this, but it's so near and dear to my heart. I was worried about timing. Section 9 actually says, hey, we know we have heritage in outer space, and we're also going to work to protect that. So the importance of the Artemis Accords is that it started with 8 nations, and now it has 16 nations. So this 16 nations have reconfirmed their commitment to the Outer Space Treaty and also agreed on the framework for filling the gaps of the Outer Space Treaty with those sections we talked about in space resource utilization, the concept of safety zones, space heritage, and interoperability. So another very important point about the Artemis Accords is they are also just principles and guidelines. These are not binding. This is not a binding treaty. These are nations who have come together and agreed that this is how we're going to interpret and this is how we want to explore space. There has been a counter effort to the Artemis program. The Artemis program wants to put humans on the moon. There's a counter effort to that program with Russia and China creating what they call an international lunar research base. But that does not say, they have never said, Russia and China, they're not members of the Artemis Accords, but they have not said that the Artemis Accords are wrong, because they're not, because they just reconfirm and then they try to tease out concepts in the Outer Space Treaty to assure continued peace and transparency. So I just want to end with a reminder. This is what Earth looks like from Saturn. We are just a little pale blue dot. There is a lot going on in space. There's so much for us to harness in space. And we need to really make sure, we need to use law to make sure we do it responsibly. And that doesn't mean we need to start putting down strict rules and so forth. No, we need to keep talking to each other the way we have been for the past 55 years. I have very, very high hopes. The United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space is a wonderful organization. Everybody is talking. And I truly believe that if we continue, even if we have different avenues to space from different nations, looking back on Earth, when different nations are looking back at Earth, they're going to remember that we are in this together and that the law is about creating kinship and managing our relationships. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.